You can tell a lot about somebody by what they're carrying in their hands. If you're sitting in a room and a lady walks in the room and she's got a white coat on and she's holding a stethoscope in one hand and one of those ear, nose, and throat tools in the other one, you know you're looking at a doctor. If you see a man who's walking around carrying a hammer in one hand and a drill in the other, then you know you're looking at some sort of a builder or carpenter or construction worker. If you see somebody with a revolver in one hand and a badge in the other, then you know you're probably looking at a police officer. And if you see somebody walking around with a rod and a staff, chances are you're looking at a shepherd. Y'all have seen it, Psalm 27:4. It's our verse for today. It says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And these different types of people don't just carry these things around as symbols, they carry them around as tools. A doctor intends to check your heartbeat and to figure out what's going on with your ear, nose, and throat. A construction worker is trying to build something. A police officer carries a badge and a gun because they need these things in order to do their job. And the same thing is true with the shepherd. And we're going to come back to these in a moment. I do think it might be beneficial for us to back up a minute because we're just kind of jumping in and getting going with Psalm 23. I would like to invite you once again to turn in your Bibles to Psalm 23, but I want to acknowledge that if you grew up in church and you know how these things work, then when I say turn in your Bibles to Psalm 23, that's perfectly sensible to you. You get that. But some of y'all are like, I did not grow up in church. I did not grow up with the Bible. I don't even know what y'all mean. So let me just back up a little bit for those of you who are new to this. Now, I'm not going to give you a full crash course in just a couple minutes, but I know you got leaders who would love to answer any questions you have. But the basics of it is that the Bible, as you know, is a book. But it's not like a normal book. It's a book that God has given us. But even then, it's a little bit more like a library of a bunch of different books pulled together. There's actually 66 different books in the Bible. Don't know if you knew that. And each of them sort of work together to tell the one story of the one God who's trying to save this world from the mess we've made of it. And each of them does their own job. And the book of Psalms is one of those 66 books. And it's actually the longest one. It's the one right in the middle. It's got 150 different chapters. And every single chapter in the book of Psalms is what we call a psalm. Everybody say psalm. Now, psalm, you didn't say that like you mean it. I mean, I know it's just the word psalm, but everybody say psalm. It's early, we got to stay together. So the psalm is sort of a weird thing. It's kind of like part poem, part song, part prayer, and there are all these different ways of expressing things to God. And every single book in the Bible has its own function within the one story, but the book of Psalms is really pretty unique. And it teaches us a lot of things about God, but its primary purpose is not to instruct us or to teach us. It's really more about drawing us in. It's really more about facilitating a relationship between us and God. And that's why it's mostly in the form of prayers, because it's trying to give us ways of expressing all of what's going on in our lives. And because the book of Psalms is designed to match life, it's really, really messy. And everything that you've ever felt can be found in the Psalms. Like some of the Psalms are really happy, and they're about peace and comfort and joy and celebration. And some of the Psalms are not. They're about despair and depression and anger and rage, and it's all in there. And somebody once said that most of the Bible speaks to us, but the book of Psalms speaks for us. And that's how it can work. They can speak for you and to really draw you actively into a relationship with God if you let them. But if it's going to work, you got to slow down. We can't rush our way through this and expect it to do what it's designed to do. It's sort of like this. Let's think this through in this way. Have y'all ever been cold? Raise your hand if you've ever been cold. Now, I mean like really cold. There's like phases to cold. You know what I'm saying? Like you've been cold to where it's uncomfortable, but then you get past the point where you're uncomfortable cold. Y'all ever been angry cold? You know what I'm talking about? Like you don't even know why you're mad except that you're cold, and so you're just mad about everything. But then if you stay in the cold, it gets worse, and then you go through the like phase of numb cold, and then you come to scary cold. Anybody been scary cold? Where you're like kind of terrified. So I want you to imagine with me, if you can, let's say you're let's say you're like hiking up on a snowy mountain and you're part of this camping deal and you've come prepared and so you know what's coming and you're aware of things, and so you decide for whatever reason while you're hiking up on this mountain that you're going to go for a hike by yourself. And you go off by yourself for a bit because you think you know the weather and you think you know the way, but what you don't anticipate is that it starts snowing. Now you're probably a couple miles away from camp and it starts snowing and you're not too worried, and so you think, I probably ought to kind of start to make my way back. But as you start to make your way back, the snow starts to fall heavier and then heavier and then heavier until eventually, you're straight up in a blizzard. And you're starting to be a little bit worried because you can't find your way. And you pass through the phases of cold. Like at first you're angry because this is annoying, and then you start to get numb, and then pretty quickly you're afraid because you're not sure if you're going to be able to make it back to camp. And so you're trying to make your way back to camp. The trail's gone, and you're doing the best you can to follow your compass and to follow the signs. And then about the time you start to get afraid, you look up over the horizon, and you see just above the trees some smoke coming out. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. There's a fire. And so you make your way to the fire, and you're trying to not fall, but you're sort of making your way through the trees. And then you come up on this, and sure enough, there's a clearing in the trees, and there's a cabin up here in the woods. And you see that there's a chimney in the cabin, and act of smoke rising from the top. And you walk up to the door, and you look inside the door of this cabin, and you can see a fire blazing inside. And you think to yourself, I do not know whose cabin this is, and I do not care if I have to break down the doors, but I will get warm. You know what I'm saying? And so you go up to the door, and you turn that knob, and sure enough, it just straight opens, and you walk in, and you throw your gloves down, and you stand in front of the fire, and you count to 10. And then you turn around and walk back outside. Let me ask you a question. Are you warm? No. And is the problem the fire? No, the fire is perfectly fine. The fire is perfectly capable of making you hot, but you got to linger by the fire in order for the fire to do its work. You got to linger by the fire to get warm. And that's how the Bible works, y'all. Sometimes we treat the Bible like that, like we just want to pop in for a verse or two and then pop out and expect it to do its transformational work in us. But that is not how the Bible works. You got to linger to let it do its work. And that's why all week long we're going to keep on reflecting on Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is a fascinating poem, and we looked at the first part of it yesterday, and the first few verses of Psalm 23, they're pretty, they're beautiful, they're idyllic, it's this peaceful scene, and we've been chilling out to some of these scenes, and it's this green pastures and quiet waters, and everything's at rest, and maybe you heard that, and maybe you've read that, and maybe you think, yeah, that sounds great, like that sounds wonderful, that sounds lovely, but that is not my life. Maybe that's the response that you've been feeling as you've heard this description of green pastures and quiet waters, that doesn't seem to match your reality. And at the end of the day, you don't have to live very long before you get to a point where you realize, man, it's not always green pastures and quiet waters. It's not always strawberries in Disneyland. Some of y'all know this all too well. I don't know the nature of your pain, but I know it's real because I'm watching you this week. And maybe for you, there's just these sort of external threats that come at you. Maybe for you, it's school. School is kind of a battlefield for you, honestly, and I don't know if it's because there's some sort of, bullies or punks that just mistreat you, or maybe it's not so much that. Maybe it's the academic pressure of meeting somebody's standard, or maybe it's the team that you're on, of keeping up with that standard, or maybe it's just that you feel lonely. I don't know. Maybe for you, it's not so much school, but it's home. Like you come home, and it's the opposite of calm. It's a chaos cluster, man. It's just a mess, and maybe it's because your parents aren't good to you. I don't know. I hope that's not the case, but I'm sure it is for some of you. Your parents just aren't good to you. And they neglect you, and they mistreat you, and God forbid, they may even in some cases abuse you, and that's your world. And maybe for you, it's not so much that your parents are bad, it's that they were good, but then they're gone. Y'all, I can't get it out of my head. Just a few weeks ago, it's been a couple months now, we were at this funeral back home, and there was this young lady in our church that died, young to me, not to you. She's 33-year-old mama, and she passed away kind of out of nowhere, and she left behind a 5-year-old son. And we're in this funeral, and we're about halfway through the funeral, and it's obviously very sad and very tragic. And then at a certain point, the kid just starts screaming, I want my mom. I want my mom. And he never stops. And what do you say in that moment? This is his story now. And maybe that's your story. I don't know what your story is, but if you live long enough, you know that things are going to happen. They're going to make life hard. And let's be real with one another. It's not just the things that happen to us. It's not just the external threats. It sometimes is the internal foolishness. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about me. And if you're like me, sometimes you make decisions that make your life a mess. You find yourself going down a path that you know is probably not going to end well, and in fact, it doesn't. And maybe when you come to the psalm, you think to yourself, yeah, all that's fine and good for the good people, but that's not for me. And what I want to tell you is the psalm speaks for this part of your life too. You just got to keep reading. Psalm 27:4, even though I walk through the darkest valley. I want you to notice first and foremost that this verse does not present the dark valley as a possibility, but as a reality. The question, it's not like if I might someday walk through the darkest valley. It's not maybe someday I'll end up in the darkest valley. It's even though I walk through the darkest valley. Because the darkest valley is a fact. The darkest valley is a given. and it has been or will be part of your story because that's just the way all stories go. And let's kind of break this down a little bit so that we can understand what the psalm is saying. The phrase darkest valley, some of y'all maybe learned Psalm 23 in a different translation. You ever heard the phrase, the valley of the shadow of death? And so there's two different ways of kind of reading this, and it's because the poem was written originally not in English, but in Hebrew, and the words are hard to know how to translate. Like, we know that the phrase has the word valley in it, and we know that the word darkness is in there, but then there's this other word that sometimes means like extra dark or deep, deep darkness, but at other times the word means death. So it could be like the valley of deep darkness, or it could be like the valley of the dark shadows of death. And we don't really know how to take it, and honestly, I'm not sure it really makes a whole lot of difference because it's kind of the same thing. I mean, that's why you're afraid of the dark, because you don't know what's there, you know? And maybe if you think about the land of Israel, it makes sense a little bit. I don't know if you've ever been over there or if you've seen pictures of it, but the land of Israel is very hilly. And not like green hills of East Tennessee, but like, it's almost like a maze. And so you could be walking along and then you just can't see around the corner a lot of time. And so I imagine being a shepherd there, you're constantly on guard. You're constantly worried because there could be something around the corner that you can't see, and that thing could pose a threat to you and your sheep. And that's kind of the picture, right? That's what we're afraid of when we're afraid of the dark. And I'm not going to ask you if any of y'all are still afraid of the dark, but some of y'all remember what it was like. And the reason why you're afraid of it is because there might be something there that could hurt you. I remember, I'd forgotten about this, but I got a bunch of siblings. I got 4 sisters and a brother. And one of my sisters is 10 years older than me. And a few years ago, she was telling me about how when we were growing up, and we still both lived at the house, there was this room in our house. It was our laundry room, and it was kind of like the freaky room. Y'all have a room in your house that's just kind of scary. And I don't know why the laundry room was what it was, but it was this dark corner room, and it kind of always smelled funny, and weird sounds are coming out of it, and the lights seemed like they never worked, you know. And apparently, I forgot this, but apparently when Cassandra, my little sister, was 6 years old, she told me, Michael, I'm afraid of the dark in that room. And apparently what I told her when I was 16 and she was 6 was, oh, Cassandra, it's not the darkness that you're afraid of. It's what might be in the darkness that you can't see that could hurt you. It's like, it's a weird thing to say to a 6-year-old, you know? But it's true. It's true. And it's not just true of the laundry room. It's true of the world. Like, you live in a world full of dark forces that are out to get you, only some of which you can see. And if you're a person who's like afraid, if you're a person who struggles with anxiety, I don't think you're crazy. I think you're paying attention, because the world is a dark, scary, dangerous place full of forces that are coming at you. Personal forces, social forces, political forces, relational forces, and the ones most invisible, spiritual forces, are ones that are most dangerous. You have plenty of reasons to be afraid, but you have a better reason not to fear. Psalm 27:4, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. I'm going to say it again. You have plenty of reasons to be afraid, but you have a better reason not to fear. And it's not because Jesus protects you from the valley. It's that he promises to be with you in the valley. The word of the day is presence, because the promise is that he will walk with you through the dark places of your life. You know, I picture hiking with Jesus, and it's just, you guys been hiking, and you know how sometimes you come upon the sign that tells you what trail you're about to enter? I picture hiking with him, and we're just sort of walking along, making our way through whatever, and we come upon this sign, and it's kind of like you can look over in this area, and you can't see very far because there's this dark corridor, and behind it is who knows what. You literally don't know because you can't see. And there's a sign on there that says, Valley of the Shadow of Death. And I'm looking at Jesus like, hey, we're going around this, right? And he's like, nope. And he just starts walking. Like, that's Jesus. This reminds me of my favorite Viking proverb. So the Viking lords used to tell their children, hey, the cave you least want to enter is home to the dragon you must slay in order to obtain the treasure you most desire. That's what they tell their kids. And you get it, right? The point is, if you want something worth wanting, then you're going to have to go through something scary to get it. And I think of this Psalm 23:4 as Jesus' Viking Lord moment. Except he doesn't just stand outside and say, go get your dragon. He says, I'm going to be with you all along the way. The word of the day is presence, because the question is not whether you're going to find yourself in the darkest valley. The question is who's going to be with you when you get there. And that's the thing about darkness, is you can't see. But just because you can't see him doesn't mean he isn't here. This reminds me of something we did a couple of months ago with our family. Early on this summer, we decided we were going to actually spend some time over in Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains. And so we did a lot of hiking and camping. It's the kind of thing we like to do. And one of the things we did on this trip was we decided we were going to go on this float trip. And so we drove down to this area, and it's like, you know how it is. You rent the inner tubes, and you just kind of float down the river. It's pretty fun. And so we had this all scheduled out and planned. And the night before, my wife, Beth, has a dream. That in the dream, my son, my 11-year-old son, Carson, he hits his head on a rock, and he starts bleeding. And then we're trying to get him to safety, and we can't find anybody to help him, and then she just wakes up. And she told me about this the next morning. And I don't ignore my wife's dreams because she's had a few of these suckers that have come true. We'll tell you about those another time. But we're talking like, well, what do we do? Like this is freaky. This is no joke, but we don't want to be paralyzed by fear. And so we decided we're going to go. We're going to go on this float trip. And so we get down there and we're checking in at the counter. And the lady's like, everything's not too scary today, but we have had a decent bit of rain. So we do have some class 2, class 3 rapids. So you might want to be careful. And she and I are just looking at each other. And we get out on the water, and usually in these moments, I tell my kids, I'm like, y'all just go for it. Like, they're old enough to just figure it out, so y'all just get out there and go. And with my dude, it's like, man, you just stay alive, buddy, because this is how you learn how to become a man. But on this day, I was not messing around. Like, I didn't tell him about the dream, but I stayed close to him the whole time. I literally gripped my hand on this young man's inner tube, and I did not let go the whole way through. And it was fun, man. We had a good time. And there were some moments that were a little iffy, but I remember one time I look over at a certain point, and we're about to hit some rapids. And I look over at him right beside me because I'm holding his tube. And he's just chilling. He's literally eyes closed, arms stretched out, just relaxed. I'm like, buddy, you got to hold on. He's like, what are you talking about? This is easy. That's like, I bet it is for you, And I think about that moment. It's like literally his eyes are closed. He cannot see me. But he is not afraid because he knows I'm right here. Just because you can't see Jesus doesn't mean he isn't here. And the word of the day is presence because he doesn't protect you from the darkest valleys, but he promises to be with you in them. Because the question is not whether you're going to find yourself there. The question is whether you're going to be alone when you do. And Jesus promises that if you belong to him, you are never alone. But that's the frustrating part of it is it's just a promise. Like you can't see him. I don't know if you've ever been in deep darkness so you can't tell the difference between oxygen and concrete, but that's the valley. And you're looking around going, Jesus, like I hear your promise, but I don't know that you're there. And that's where these come in. That's why these tools are so important. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You need to understand what these are for because they're not for the same thing. A rod is something that a shepherd would carry, and it was usually about like this, just thin enough to carry but thick enough to do some damage, about 2.5 feet long. And this is not primarily for the sheep. Now, the sheep might occasionally experience this rod if the sheep is like ignoring the shepherd's warnings and it's covering, walking along a cliff in danger of falling over to the side, and the only way the shepherd can keep it safe is to pop it on the rear. Then that's what the shepherd's going to do. But this is not primarily for the sheep. And in the darkness, the sheep don't tend to feel the rod, they hear it, because this is primarily for the bandits and wolves that threaten the sheep. And the sheep experience the rod when they hear this thing crack the jaw of the wolf that is coming at them and hear it breathe its last breath. And y'all better believe that Jesus carries a rod and he's protecting you from spiritual forces that you are most of the time completely unaware of. But this staff, this is for you. This is the ministry of protection against internal threat. This is the ministry of correction, and this is what we feel. Now, the staff is intentionally designed differently than the rod. It's thinner and it's longer because its work is gentle and it needs to have some reach. And so the way this works is if a sheep's kind of fallen off course, the shepherd will just real gently reach out and tap the sheep on its back and say its name and say, come on back in. And usually that's enough. But if it's not enough and the sheep keeps wandering, the shepherd just reaches a little further. I'm not going to get you, baby, don't worry. But it just sort of hooks that sheep by the foot, or it puts it around its neck, and it just gently pulls that thing back in to keep it safe. The rod and the staff are the ways in which we experience the protection of Jesus through his presence in the darkest valley. And this brings us to this particular moment, in this particular day, in your particular journey. I do not know what's going on in your life. I do not know the details of your story, but I know that by this point in the week, you know that Jesus is calling out to you in some form or fashion. that something has happened in you that you have a hard time explaining. Now, if you're living in open rebellion against God and you've been consistently ignoring his warnings, then he may be using the rod to get your attention, to pop you on the rear and keep you from falling off the edge of the cliff. And if this is the case, then I pray you respond wisely and come back in line and trust that your shepherd has your best interests in mind. But most of you are experiencing this. You're experiencing the gentle prodding or the gentle hook of the shepherd's staff, because there's a part of your life that's a little bit out of whack and it's in danger of getting worse. Now, I don't know what it is for you, but you probably do. Maybe the Spirit's already begun doing some work in you. Maybe for some of you it is a relationship, any kind of relationship, one that doesn't pull you closer to God but actually pushes you further away. And you've known for a while that this is not something that the Lord wants for you. Or maybe it's a habit that you've begun to form, or perhaps formed for a long time. Perhaps it's something that you watch. Maybe it's something that you say. Maybe it's a habit of not telling the truth. Maybe it's a habit of talking trash about people who you say you care about. And you can just gently feel in your spirit that the Holy Spirit is reaching out to you and saying, this is a part of your life that needs some attention. This is a part of your life that's pulling you off track. That's the shepherd's staff, and he's trying to get your attention. And I can't decide for you how you're going to respond, because it's totally up to you. There's one other thing I need you to know from the psalm before we're done, and it's my favorite detail in the psalm, but I'm going to tell you I don't fully understand it. I noticed this detail a couple years ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since. It's the pronouns. Now, I don't know if you noticed that in the psalm there's a shift in the way the shepherd is talked about. And in the first few verses, it's in the third person. He leads me, he guides me, he refreshes me. And then you get to verse 4, and there's a switch, and now it's you. You are with me. You anoint me. You will protect me. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that is kind of counterintuitive, because it's actually in the first parts of the psalm where the shepherd leads us to the happy places that we're talking about he, third person. But it's when we get to the second part of the psalm where we're going through the dark places that all of a sudden the psalmist is addressing the shepherd directly. You. And maybe that's the moment that you're in right now so far in this week, is that you've been thinking about Jesus, you've been watching him do some work, but you've been sort of standing at a distance and you've not been directly addressing him. And the invitation in this moment is to turn your attention to him and say, okay, I need you, Jesus. I'm ready to do some work. Now, I don't quite understand the mystery of this, but there's a part of me that thinks that what happens in the darkness is that simultaneously you're worried about multiple things. And so you're starting to realize that the things that you've been depending on are not exactly working for you, and you want to turn your attention to Jesus. But at the same time, you just feel like he's nowhere to be found. And that's when you have to remember that just because you can't see him and just because you can't feel him doesn't mean he isn't here. It's like they say, the darker the valley, the closer the Lord. So may we sense the presence of our shepherd and respond faithfully. May you be comforted by his rod and his staff. May you have eyes to hear and ears to see, that even in the deep, deep darkness, Jesus is here.